"It's ours now, honey," my mother-in-law Brenda said as she leaned against the mahogany front door of my house, spinning a brand new brass key on her finger. I had just gotten back from a spa weekend that my husband Mark had practically begged me to take, only to find my designer suitcases piled on the wet grass like yesterday's trash. Mark was standing right behind her, hands jammed in his pockets, looking at his expensive shoes instead of me. I didn't scream and I didn't cry. I just looked at the shiny new deadbolt and felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face as I pulled out my phone. Now, I have a question for every single person watching this right now. If you found out your husband spent months faking a financial crisis just to trick you into signing your house over to his mother, what would you do? Would you walk away and try to rebuild your life from zero? Or would you stay right there on that driveway and burn their entire world down with the truth? Tell me in the comments, does blood really matter when they treat you like an enemy? I'm reading every single one of your responses because I need to know if I'm the only one who thinks playing nice is for losers. Brenda adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes darting to the neighbor's house. She was obsessed with her image. To her, this wasn't just a building, it was a status symbol in the best zip code in the suburbs. "You look a little lost, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness she used at church. "But honestly, Mark needs a wife who actually understands his business needs. You've been a distraction. We've handled the paperwork, and the trust is now the sole owner. You're officially a guest who overstayed her welcome." The truth was, Mark hadn't worked a real job in 2 years. I was the one grinding at the law firm, keeping the lights on while he consulted for Brenda's failing lifestyle brand. He thought I was a pushover because I didn't fight him when he brought home those emergency transfer papers. He thought my grief over my dad's death had made me stupid. I watched him on the porch, leaning into the house I paid for, wearing a watch I bought him, telling me I was nothing. "The neighborhood association already updated the directory," Mark added, his voice thin and shaky. "So don't bother making a scene. Mom is the head of the household now. Just take your bags and go back to your sister's apartment. It's more your speed anyway." He finally looked at me, and I saw it. The greed. He wasn't even sad. He was excited to finally be the big man in the house, even if he had to steal it from his wife to do it. "You're right, Mark," I said, keeping my voice flat. "A house should be filled with people who belong there." I looked up at the tiny black dome of the security camera above the door. It was blinking. I'd spent $3,000 on a military-grade cloud system 2 months ago after I caught Mark lying about a business trip. Every word out of their mouths was being uploaded to a server they couldn't touch. Brenda laughed, a sharp, annoying sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, stop the drama, Sarah. It's pathetic. Just grab your junk and leave. We have a lot to do. The contractors are coming at 7 tomorrow morning to gut that kitchen you loved so much. It's way too middle class for this neighborhood." She was already erasing me, itching to spend my money on marble countertops and gold fixtures. But she didn't know that the contractors she called were actually people I hired to do a special kind of demolition. I didn't head for my car. I walked straight toward the guest house at the back of the property. Mark turned pale. I tapped a code into the side door, a code Mark thought he'd changed last night. The door swung open, and a girl in her early 20s, Mark's assistant, Chloe, was sitting on the sofa. She was wearing my favorite silk robe and sipping from a bottle of my vintage wine. Brenda hadn't just moved in, she had cleared the way for Mark's new plaything to move into my backyard. "What are you doing here?" Chloe snapped, standing up and trying to look tough. She had the nerve to look at me like I was the intruder. Behind her, the guest house was filled with bags from luxury boutiques. Mark had told me we were broke and that the bank was coming for the house, but he had been spending like a king on this girl. "I'm the person who owns the deed to this furniture," I said. I pulled out my phone and tapped the app for the guest house's smart system. The lights went black, the AC cut off, and the smart lock on the door clicked shut. And as of right now, Chloe, I've reported that robe and those bags as stolen property. I'd suggest you find a different place to sleep because the power isn't coming back on. Mark came running across the lawn, screaming his head off. "You can't do that! That's my guest! You're harassing her!" He tried to grab my phone, but I stepped back. "One more inch, Mark, and the police get the footage of you hitting me. I've got it on 3 different angles." He stopped. He was a classic suburban bully, all talk until someone stood up to him. "You really should have read the fine print of that deed I signed, Brenda," I said, turning to my mother-in-law, who was puffing her chest out on the lawn. "I didn't sign it over to you. I signed it over to the Vance Holding Group." Brenda's jaw dropped. She knew that name. It was the company my dad had set up for my inheritance. I had used a legal move to transfer the house into a corporate shell I controlled. By accepting the house to save it from foreclosure, they had actually signed away their rights to claim any of Mark's other assets. "That's a lie!" Brenda yelled. "My lawyer checked it." "Your lawyer is a drunk who owes me a favor," I whispered. "Who do you think has been paying his bar tab at the country club for the last year? I knew you'd try this the second Mark started acting shady. You thought you were playing chess, but you were playing checkers with a grand master." The look on her face was worth every cent I'd spent on the private investigator. Mark was frantically tapping on his phone. "Sarah, the offshore account. It's empty. Where is the 500,000? He looked like he was about to have a heart attack right there on the grass. That was the money he had stolen from our joint savings, money he thought he'd hidden in the Caymans. "I moved it," I said, shrugging. Since it was a joint account and I had the logging, I invested it into a trust for Leo. Mark's face went from white to green. Leo was the son he'd had before we met, the one he completely ignored for a decade because Brenda told him a kid would ruin his image. I had found Leo and his mom 6 months ago. "The money is legally his now, Mark. If you want it back, you'll have to sue your own son in a very public court case. How do you think the charity board will feel about that?" Brenda's phone started blowing up with notifications. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. "The hospital board? They're asking for my resignation?" I hadn't just moved the money. I had sent a nice little package to the local news and the hospital foundation. It included the recordings of Brenda talking about how she borrowed money from the charity's gala funds to pay for Mark's mistress's apartment. Brenda's whole life was built on being a pillar of the community. Now she was just a common thief in a designer's suit. The blue and red lights of a squad car finally pulled into the driveway. Mark straightened his tie, looking relieved. "Officer Miller, thank God you're here. My ex-wife is being violent and refusing to leave." He actually thought his golf buddies from the precinct were going to save him. But the officer didn't even look at Mark. He walked straight to the porch and handed Brenda a piece of paper. "Brenda Vance, we have a warrant for your arrest regarding the embezzlement from the Children's Hospital Fund." Brenda didn't even hesitate. She pointed her finger straight at Mark. "It was him. He made me do it. He told me he needed the money for his business. I'm just a victim." Mark looked at his mother like he was seeing her for the first time. The woman who had told him he was her perfect boy was throwing him to the wolves to save her own skin. "Mom, what are you saying?" Mark stammered. "We did this together." "I don't know what you're talking about," she shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that probably broke glass inside the house. "Officer, he's been threatening me. He's unstable." She was already rehearsing her poor old lady routine. It was the most pathetic thing I'd ever seen, and I made sure my phone was getting every second of it. "The evidence is in the library safe," I told the cops. Brenda tried to block the door, but the officer moved her aside like she was a piece of furniture. Inside that safe wasn't just the house deed, it was a black ledger Mark had kept. He was dumb enough to write down every bribe he'd paid to city officials and every cent he'd skimmed from his mother's company. He thought it was his insurance against her. Instead, it was a roadmap for the DA to put them both away for a long time. The cops came back out 5 minutes later with the ledger and a box of cash that Mark hadn't reported to the IRS. Mark's business crisis wasn't real. He was just laundering money through the estate. Every 45 seconds, the situation got worse. Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. The list of charges was growing longer than the driveway we were standing on. Chloe came out of the guest house, her suitcase trailing behind her. She didn't even look at Mark as he sat on the curb with his head in his hands. "I have the voice memos, officer," she said, handing over her phone. "He told me he was going to gaslight the bitch until she signed the house over and then move me in. He said he'd been poisoning her mind against her own family for years." Mark looked like he wanted to sink into the pavement. He had trusted a girl who was only there for the free wine and the silk robes. "Chloe, how could you?" Mark whispered. She didn't even answer. She just hopped into an Uber and disappeared, leaving Mark with nothing but a pair of handcuffs and a very angry mother. Mark tried one last move. He jumped up and ran for his luxury SUV, probably thinking he could make a break for the state line. He hit the button on his key fob, but the car didn't make a sound. "That car belongs to the company, Mark," I said, walking over to him. "And as the boss of that company, I've already reported it stolen. I also use the remote kill switch. You're not going anywhere but the back of that police cruiser." He stood there clicking a piece of plastic while the cops closed the gap. The neighbors weren't just watching from behind their curtains anymore. They were lined up on the sidewalk like they were watching a parade. Brenda tried to hide her face behind her $5,000 leather purse as the deputy led her to the squad car, but her expensive heels caught on the gravel of the driveway she had just claimed was hers. She stumbled, nearly hitting the pavement, and I heard a collective gasp from the crowd. These were people she had looked down on for years, people she'd reported to the HOA for having the wrong shade of mulch or leaving their trash cans out too long. Now, they were all zooming in with their phones, capturing the queen of the suburbs in chrome handcuffs. I saw Mrs. Gable, the woman Brenda had tried to ban from the neighborhood pool, standing right at the edge of my property. She didn't say a word, but she held her phone up high, making sure she got a clear shot of Brenda's smeared makeup and the way her designer wig had shifted just enough to show the gray hair underneath. The woman who spent a lifetime acting like she was made of gold was being revealed as nothing but cheap plated tin. Brenda looked at me over the roof of the police car, and for a second, the mask of upper-class grace completely shattered. Her eyes were full of a raw, ugly hate that made her look like a stranger. "You're a snake, Sarah," Mark screamed as they shoved him into the second car. "You've ruined this family. You'll be a pariah in this town. No one will ever trust a woman who backstabs her own husband." I walked right up to the window of the police cruiser and leaned down so only he could hear me. "The town already knows, Mark. While you were busy liquidating our marriage, I was busy making sure the neighborhood council saw every single bank statement. And as for the house, I sold it 4 hours ago. The closing was handled electronically while I was at the spa." Brenda let out a muffled shriek from the other car. To her, real estate was her only identity. "I didn't sell it to another family, Mark," I continued, my voice cold and steady. "I sold the land to a developer who specializes in high-density housing. In 6 months, this estate won't exist. There will be 40 low-income apartments right where your precious gazebo stands. Your mother's elite neighborhood is about to become exactly what she fears most: accessible." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned my back on the flashing lights and walked up to the front door Brenda had so proudly locked. I didn't reach for a key.
I pulled a heavy iron sledgehammer out of the back of my SUV, the one I'd bought on the way home. With one clean swing, I smashed the lock assembly right out of the mahogany wood. The sound of the wood splintering was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in years. I didn't want the house, but I wasn't going to leave it the way they wanted it. I stepped into the foyer, and the silence of the house felt like a physical weight. Brenda's signature scent, a cloying, expensive rose perfume, lingered in the air, but it didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a crime scene. I walked into the dining room where she had already set the table with her heirloom china, the set she claimed had been in the Vance family for generations. I knew the truth. She'd bought it at an estate fail 10 years ago and fabricated the story to sound more upper class. I didn't break the plates. Instead, I took a heavy black permanent marker from my pocket. On every single plate, I wrote a name. I wrote the names of the charity donors she'd stolen from. I wrote the name of the mistress Mark had been hiding in the guest house. I wrote the name of the son Mark had abandoned. I wanted the forensic team to see those names when they came to seize the assets. I wanted the state to know that every luxury in this room was bought with someone else's pain. I heard a thud outside. It was the sound of the police car doors slamming shut. Mark was still shouting, his voice echoing through the open front door, but he sounded small now. He sounded like a child throwing a tantrum in a sandbox that wasn't his anymore. I walked to the fireplace and looked at the portrait of Brenda that hung above the mantel. She looked so regal in the painting, so untouchable. I reached up and tilted it just a few inches to the left. It was a small thing, but in a house that she'd demanded be perfect, it was the ultimate insult. I walked back out to the porch. The neighborhood was buzzing. I saw groups of women who had gone to tea with Brenda for a decade, whispering and pointing. They weren't coming to her defense. They were already checking their own bank statements, wondering if Brenda had skimmed from their private clubs too. This was the social execution she deserved. In the suburbs, your reputation is your only currency, and Brenda Vance was officially bankrupt. "Officer!" Brenda shrieked as the car began to roll. "Tell her she can't do this! That's my furniture! Those are my roses!" The officer didn't even look back. He just rolled up the window, cutting off her voice. I stood on the top step and watched the taillights of the squad cars disappear around the corner. I felt a strange, hollow sort of peace. It wasn't the happily ever after I'd imagined when I married Mark, but it was the only ending that made sense. The moving trucks finally pulled into the driveway. The drivers looked confused when they saw the splintered door and the neighbors lined up on the sidewalk. "Pack everything," I told the lead mover. "If it has a Vance name on it, or if Brenda picked it out, I want it gone. Don't take it to my new place. Take it to the charity warehouse downtown. Tell them it's an anonymous donation from a grieving widow who finally found her sight." I walked through the house one last time as they began to wrap the furniture in plastic. I went into Mark's office. It was full of awards and trophies he'd bought for himself. Salesman of the Year for a company that didn't exist. Man of the Year from a board he'd bribed. I gathered them all into a cardboard box and left them on the curb. They weren't worth the space in the truck. I got into my SUV and started the engine. The GPS was already set for a city 300 miles away, a place where the air didn't smell like rose perfume and betrayal. I looked at the house in the rearview mirror. It looked like a tomb. I realized then that Brenda and Mark hadn't stolen my life. They had just been the janitors who helped clear out the trash. I hit the gas, the tires crunching over the gravel Brenda loved so much. I didn't look back. I didn't wonder what they were doing at the station or how they'd afford a lawyer. That wasn't my problem anymore. I was driving toward a life where no one else held the keys, and where the only secrets I had were the ones I chose to keep. The locks were broken, the family was gone, and for the first time in my life, I was finally, truly free.